We see this in the verses that follow. In fact, in verse 7, God engages in a dialogue with Satan, which begins with two questions. Number one, from where have you come? And then the question that sets the stage for the unfolding drama of the next 41 plus chapters. The second question, have you considered my servant Job? These were not, by the way, fact-finding questions. Yahweh knew well where Satan had come from, as well as what he had been doing. Something came to my attention as I read Satan's response to the Lord in verse 7. Satan answers Yahweh, quote, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it. Well, first notice, he does not say, I have come from hell. And the reason being, because he hasn't been there. In fact, that is the place of his final and eternal punishment. And so when you hear people just randomly getting conversations with the devil and bind him and tell him to go back to hell where he came from, he's never been there. That's his place of eternal punishment. But when he answers the Lord by using that, when he says from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it, he conveniently leaves something out. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, most of you know what is being said there. The Apostle Peter tells us what the devil is actually doing as he goes to and fro on the earth. Because in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, we read these words, your adversary, the devil, prowls. Sounds familiar? That's what he told the Lord he was doing in a sense. Roaming, prowling, walking all on the earth. But look at what he says. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So in other words, he's not out on a casual stroll as he's walking on the surface of the earth. What is he doing? He's actively pursuing those whom he might devour. The metaphor lion used there reveals the destructive intent as well as nature of the devil. It doesn't say that he is a lion. It says that he acts like a lion. And the attempt of the illustration is when we think of a lion, when you think about going into the wild and confronting a lion, that, well, our minds go all kinds of places with the devastation that is potentially in front of us. That's the picture trying to be painted. And then Yahweh's second question might be seen as a rhetorical one in the sense that the answer is obvious in light of what I've just said about Satan prowling or roaming the earth. And what God brought up in the first question. I believe it's safe to assume that Satan did in fact know of Job. That he did in fact know of Job. He makes it, by the way, his business as he seeks to devour and to oppose not only God, but the righteous in their service to God. He's looking. And would you not think that someone like Job, Job's piety and Job's integrity, do you think that really had escaped the devil's notice? Well, I don't think so, because verse 9 and verse 10 seem to reinforce this. Satan appears to not only be familiar with Job's wealth, his blessings from Yahweh, but also the divine protection Yahweh has provided Job. In other words, if you think about when God asked the question, have you considered my servant Job? The devil doesn't say, who? He says, oh, he only has what he has because you've protected him. And then he continues that conversation with him. These are the sources He says, you remove your hand and watch what happens. So these are the sources of Satan's challenge to God we see in verse 11. And this, he continues, he says, but stretch out your hand and touch all he has, and he will curse you to your face. It might come as a surprise to us, and we talked about this last week, that Yahweh does not dismiss the devil's challenge. In fact, if you look at verse 12, the very first part of it, and the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. That's a startling statement there. I mean, in our natural thinking, would we not say, why did God just say, get out of my presence? Banish him? But he doesn't. He doesn't dismiss the devil's challenge. Satan, though possessing power and insight common to angels, we know from Psalm 8 verse 5, as well as from Hebrews 2:7, that humans are in order, at least at this present time, beneath the angels. So angels possess a power that humans at this time do not possess. But don't overestimate that. In fact, you almost hear people say, the devil was reading my mind. He can't do that, by the way. He's not omniscient. He's not all-knowing. So the question might be raised, did Satan really think that Job's piety and his integrity were this shallow, that if God were to remove the hedge, that he would curse God to his face? Or at worst was disingenuine, that Job was just faking it because he was enjoying the blessings? Well, perhaps that's what Satan did believe. Knowing the deceitfulness of the human heart and human nature, even though he was not able to read Job's heart, did not know Job's mind and intentions, he is very familiar with human behavior and human nature. He's been watching them for 6,000 years and has learned an awful lot. So he could only hope this was true of Job, and if it proved to be so, it would also impugn God's character. And this was a wager Satan was willing to take. However, if Satan is not omniscient, and he isn't, God is omniscient. God is all-knowing. He knows the thoughts and intents of Job's heart. I just thought about the number of verses that I could have brought out to bring that point home, but just a couple of them. In Psalm 66, verse 18, listen to what the psalmist writes. He says, if I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. Why would the Lord have not listened? He would have not listened because he knew what was in the person's heart. He would have known of the iniquity in the person's heart. God does know the person's heart. Psalm 139, verse 23, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And indeed, God does know our hearts and our thoughts. In fact, the psalmist tells us later, near the close of the Psalms, that our thoughts are like words to God's ears. That's very sobering to think about that, isn't it? So, here's the question. If God truly knew the genuineness of Job's devotion, piety, and integrity, which indeed he did, why did he not simply just rebuke the devil and banish him from his presence? I'm going to answer it as the best I can. Such a question only proves our own finite understanding of the things of God, as well as revealing of our insatiable desire to know all the whys. How many times have we heard our kids ask us why? And we judge our kids. Don't ask me why, when we ourselves are asking why all the time. Listen very carefully. God is under, and this is powerful to understand. It's not easy, but it's important. God is under no obligation whatsoever to explain his motives, nor in the case of granting Satan permission to try Job, proving anything to anyone. In fact, keep going back to my default verse, which we will get to when we come to near the close of this particular study in Job, when God asked that infamous question of Job, who is this that darkens counsel without knowledge? Profound statement. Who is it that's asking God something who has such little understanding? So the fact remains, we know that from the book, God did allow Satan to try Job. While under no obligation to prove anything, God in his omniscience, according to his own will and his own purpose, grants Satan, because he could not have done it without God's permission, grants Satan permission, and as we'll see, the integrity and piety of Job is in fact proven to be genuine. James Durham, in his lectures on Job, reminds us that God is not appeasing Satan by giving him permission, but instead is proving the reality of three things. Number one, his own grace. Secondly, that Satan is a liar. And third, God himself is faithful. Now, I'm in no way implying that this is easy for us to grasp. When we get into the material tonight, we're going to see that. This is not easy to grasp. I don't even know if it's possible for us to grasp. I think a person that says, oh yeah, I've read the book, I've got it all figured out, has probably deceived themselves. But in spite of this, we are confronted with the reality and the truth of it. In verse 12, we not only see Yahweh granting Satan permission to prove Job, but we also see God's power to set the boundaries of the test. Look at what God says at the end of verse 12. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. In other words, your leash ends here. I'm granting you the permission to do this, but only this. These are the boundaries in which you're going to have to operate. And so, in his first trial, Job's person is exempt, off limits to the devil. Yahweh is fully aware of the devil's zeal and eagerness to assault Job, and so he limits him. What do you think if God had not set any boundaries? I mean, it gets as bad as it gets. It would have, the wrath of this enemy of ours, this arch enemy, would have been poured out unlimited. I mean, just think about it. But you stop and think what we're going to look at tonight. How much worse could it have been? It could have been a lot worse. It gets worse than what we're going to see tonight. So we see in verse 12, closes with Satan leaving the Lord's presence, and no doubt to immediately begin his assault on Job. I thought about this. You know, he wastes no time in planning Job's demise. I look at it, I think of it this way, frothing at the mouth, foam easing from his foul and lying mouth, he sets out to prove God wrong and to destroy a blameless and righteous person. The scene now transitions in verse 13 and continuing through verse 22. Let's look at these for a moment. Let's read now the other verses. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job rose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Speechless. If you're not out of breath after just hearing that read, then check your pulse. What we witness there is, by all human standards, extremely brutal, isn't it? Our narrator gives us a succession of relentless attacks. Unable to touch Job's person, Satan launches what I call a blitzkrieg, which all that is an intense military campaign intended to bring about a swift victory. That's what Satan's wanting to do. Close this out quickly. Okay, I can't get Job's body, but watch this. And it's a blitz against Job by employing what appears to be the forces of nature and even wicked groups of people. These attacks are carried out in such rapid succession, and that's the reason that I read them the way that I did. While he was yet speaking, while he was yet speaking, while he was yet speaking, while he was yet speaking. Job hadn't even had a chance to take a breath. Again, James Durham comments, quote, Job gets not leave to draw his breath after one to make for another one. Let's look at these attacks individually and look at them carefully. Again, notice the rapid sequence of all these events found in the respected phrase, while he was yet speaking. Verses 13 through 15. What do we see there? I'm not going to reread them, for my time's going to run out on them again if I'm not careful. But what do we see in verses 13 through 15? We see the loss of livestock at the hands of a group of people called the Sabeans. This is the first attack on Job's material blessings. Job's oxen, while working, and his donkeys, while feeding, were stolen by a group, the Sabeans, an Arab tribe famous for marauding or raiding other tribes and later even cities. They were famous for this. They not only stole the livestock, but murdered the servants attending them. Think about it. When it says, if you look for a second there, when it says, struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, that's a gentle way in our English translation of saying, this fireworks back there, somebody being funny, is a keen way of saying, a nice way of saying, they literally hacked them to pieces. So they didn't just stab them and going about their business. Striking them down with a sword is a description of literally chopping them to pieces. So they weren't just satisfied in taking the oxen and the donkey. They wanted blood. And yet they spared one. You can always, most of us have seen movies where if a opposing force or group of people want to threaten someone, they will spare one person out of everybody they're killing and say, go back and tell your boss what you saw happen. Hoping that it will do what? Instill absolute fear in the person that the messenger is going to. I'm wondering what, we don't think much about the messenger. I wonder what he felt like. I mean, the only person you've turned around, you've watched everybody you've been with hacked to pieces by these savage marauders, and then all of a sudden you're let loose and told to go back and tell what you've seen. Then in verse 16, I will read it because it is important. It says, and while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The loss of yet more of his livestock, as well as more of his servants, this time by the fire of God falling from heaven. Now, it's careful that we not misinterpret the phrase, the fire of God. If you look through the Old Testament and you see the way that expression is actually used, it's not to imply that God was the source of the event, that God sent fire from heaven, even though he can indeed has done that. We already know who is carrying out this dastardly thing. What we see here is lightning that came down like fire to the ancients and even to us. That's exactly what it looks like coming out of heaven. I remember years ago when Fred Gunter, a friend of mine, his daughter Gretchen was one of Sarah's friends in school. We were at the airport in Orlando getting ready to put them on a plane to fly out to Idaho to a large Girl Scout thing that they were all big nationwide jamboree thing that they were doing. And he and I were standing out by the sky cap. And if you notice at the Orlando airport, there are lightning rods along the edge of the house. There's a reason for that. And a storm was brewing, and he and I were standing there, and at one moment, that is exactly what it appeared happened to us. We saw the flash behind us, and it was so bright, and then the subsequent, which was almost immediate because they were associated so closely with one another, the clap of thunder, it knocked Fred Gunter out to our knees. We hit our knees because it just hit right up behind us. And I thought, I can't even imagine it yet. Some have been struck by lightning, have been killed. Others have been struck by lightning and have survived to tell about it. I don't ever want that experience. But at that moment, I only thought about what it would have been like only for that to have hit us, rather than hit that lightning rod on the building. But that's exactly what happens. Lightning comes down like fire from heaven, and in an instant, it consumed not only the sheep, all of them, by the way, but all the servants as well, save one, again, who was to deliver the message to God. Think about this. I'm not saying this is actually the way that it was, but think about it. All these servants standing around with these sheep, and all of a sudden everybody is struck by lightning beside you, and they're smoking. Their corpses are smoking, and you're left standing. You're looking at dead animals and dead people, and you're left standing. It's not over yet. Verse 17. The Chaldeans, another group of nomadic raiders, divided into 3 different raiding parties. And they raid Job's servants, stealing the camels, and like the Sabians, they slaughter all the servants, again save one who takes the bad news to Job. In one fell swoop, 3 different events. What's happened? He has lost all of his livestock. Gone. And virtually all of his servants, except 3. And we don't know whether there were others that were in the house serving him, but all those who were out doing his bidding and work are now gone, dead. And look at verses 18 and 19. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this one. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. I can at this point imagine Job is just frozen. He's just paralyzed. And he must be thinking in the back of his mind, oh no, oh no. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. The attack Satan now carries out against Job transcends material prosperity, but is leveled at his posterity. This was, as Salvaggio writes, quote, the coup de grace, the final blow intended to kill an already wounded person of Satan's attack. I'm going to pause for a moment in order for us to truly grasp what is happening. It is one thing to say goodbye to material things. People do that all the time. When Chris preached 2 weeks ago, he gave you the illustration. He was actually speaking, it was John Wesley, who while out preaching got word that his home had burned down. And his response was, as he just paused for a moment, his preaching was to say that it was God's house anyway, and kept on preaching. It's one thing to say goodbye to material possessions. People are forced to do that every day by some tragedy, perhaps a home fire or a storm comes in. We see that in Florida where houses are destroyed in hurricanes and floods and natural catastrophes and tornadoes will go through a whole community. We've seen countless times on the TV the morning after a tornado striking a subdivision and there's nothing left but splinters of trees. There's not even houses left. Sometimes it's just the foundation and nothing, but somebody just took a trash bag and scattered trash everywhere. That's all that's left. People deal with that, sadly, all the time. That's one thing to have to deal with. But it is another thing altogether to lose either expectedly or, as in Job's case, unexpectedly, a loved one or loved ones. Tragically or naturally, the loss, it doesn't matter. Thought about this as I worked through this week. I had a lot of things going through my mind as I read this and thought about it and rewrote my notes and rewrote my notes. I can, next to losing a spouse, I can think of nothing as heart-wrenching as losing one of my children. I watched a gentleman that used to work out at the club where I used to work out and was such a cheerful, joyful person. And I lost contact with him for a little while, and then I regained contact with him because he'd come in the club and he'd be working out, but his whole countenance was completely changed. Still a nice person, polite, but very somber, very quiet, very to himself. And I asked my friend Dan Donovan, I said, Dan, what's going on? I said, he's just not the same. He said, Dan said, you don't know? I said, no. He said, well, he just lost his wife to a long bout of cancer, and it's devastated him. That's heart-wrenching. But if we're honest, those of us who are aging, or we realize that, we're getting older, and that's likely something that we will face. But it's another thing altogether to think about losing a child. No parent, as they birthed and raised their children, ever imagined having to bury them. And yet I have precious people within the sound of my voice tonight present in this building and joining us online that have done just that very thing. And if they could, they would attest that I'm telling the truth. We quite naturally think, don't we, that we will pass before them, that they will be there to bury us, and that they will go on to continue to produce future generations, bearing our name, our likeness, our genes. However, as some of us know all too well, this sorrow is not unknown to men. I have dear friends, who have buried their offspring, their sons and their daughters. I thought about it this week, from every single age category. Our closest, dearest friends who we buried Donnie just 4 years ago, lost an infant just hours after its birth. I was pastoring in Atlanta when I got that phone call that the baby had been born and there were some problems and they didn't think he was going to make it. And I remember leaving my office because my office was like this building but a different layout. And the sanctuary was a separated building from where our offices and fellowship hall were. And I remember getting Carolyn's call and Donnie's call and running over to the sanctuary. And I remember that day so well, prostrating myself on the platform and crying out to God to have mercy. Only a few hours later to get a call that what was his name again? Michael. The little Michael had passed away. So I buried their sons, infants, all the way to adults. Some of you have been with us and been with me as we've done that very thing. And even to this day, even though that time has passed, they continue to live with the memory of the sorrow. It simply doesn't seem to be natural. And some might say, it doesn't seem to be fair, does it? How horrific it is to lose one child. Multiply that times 10 at one time. Job lost all of his children in one fell swoop, 7 sons and 3 daughters. Chuck Swindoll, in his great little devotional book on Job, it's really a good, enjoyable read. He writes, quote, for the first time, think about this. He's a master teacher. Chuck Swindoll is a master teacher anyway. And he just puts it in illustrations that are just vivid. But he says, for the first time in 35, maybe 40 years, Job and his wife are childless. And they're not teenagers. They're aged at this time. All their lives, Job has been careful to cover his children in paternal care, including prayer and sacrifices. The spiritual welfare of his children was of extreme importance to Job. We see that, don't we? Every day, what was he doing? First thing in the morning, offering sacrifices, praying for them, interceding for them, covering them. Now, think for a moment. Pause. Job has lost everything. And it has all happened in short order, very quickly. Satan has taken everything from Job, with the exception, at this point, of his wife and his own life. Quite naturally, at a moment like this, some would no doubt determine that there is nothing else to live for. That's how most people would view that moment. Think for a moment of a particular time in American history when we faced the Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. In fact, if you watch any of the documentaries of the Great Depression, the day the market crashed and the days to follow, what did many people do? Many people took their own lives, jumping out of buildings, going in their offices, taking out guns and shooting themselves, doing all kinds of crazy things, unable to cope with the idea of having lost just material wealth and being utterly destitute. Material possessions were deemed by some to be more valuable than life itself. Yet I bet in the midst of that, there were some that lost everything material and went home and grabbed their family and drew them close to their breast and said, "We have each other." Job had no time. Job had no time between being advised of the losses to process anything. Perhaps he was numbed, even paralyzed by the repetitive onslaught of the news, but the final loss was all Job could bear. Finally, we see him overwhelmed. Look at verse 20. And Job rose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. Job responds, doesn't he? But it is not the way Satan anticipates. I imagine our adversary was standing back when, just at the moment the messenger delivered the news about the children, and just waiting with his horde saying, "Hold on, boys, this is it. Watch what happens next." And they're ready to celebrate. No, doesn't happen that way. Swindoll points out, we are not told how much time passed between the news of his children and the events that we read in verses 20 through 22. It doesn't matter. And he is right. It could have been immediately, or even as Swindoll comments, and I quote him here, Job may not have responded, and I love the way he paints his picture. Quote, Job may not have responded until after the burials as he stood beside 10 fresh graves, end of quote. What a vivid picture that paints in our mind. Whenever the events of these closing verses of chapter 1 in the English Bible happens, there is one thing for sure. Job can no longer hold his grief. His grief finally overcomes him. The intensity of his grief is revealed to us in the actions he engages in. And follow with me on these. Number one, he rises and tears his robe. Rising may imply he had been sitting. I thought about this, thought through the whole process of rising. May imply he had been sitting, weakened by the reports, having to sit, or either weakened by the reports, having slouched over in the sorrow, head down. He rises, straightens up, and he tears his cloak. The tearing of the robe, that's something that is known well in Eastern culture, especially in ancient Eastern culture. The tearing of the robe has always been an Eastern sign of one or two things, either of indignation or mourning. In this case, it was mourning. But look, he didn't stop there. He tears his robe, and then he commences to do what? He shaves his head. Again, yet another Eastern expression of grief. It was amazing the number of commentators I read that talked about the value of hair in the Eastern culture. That was the glory of a person. And so as a sign of great grief and sorrow, they would often shave their heads, in effect to say they have stripped themselves of any self-glory. Some of us are getting there naturally. Thirdly, and fell to the ground and worshiped. Well, that's not what the devil expected. These two actions must be seen together. Fell to the ground and worshiped. Don't separate them. Job's falling to the ground was not a display just of grief, but as the narrator clearly points out, was part of his worship. How do we know that? By the language. He does not weep in sorrow, but what does he do? He worships. The Hebrew verb here, one of 4 verbs we see in this passage, means, are you ready for this? It means to fall prostrate in utter submission and worship. The Hebrew verb is translated in the Greek. Proskuneo is the Greek word which means to worship. Rather than acting like one who is in despair, he humbles himself, falls prostrate to the ground, and worships Yahweh. Picture this. This is exactly what that word means. It means to lay face down, face in the dirt, body extended, and worshiping. In ancient culture, this position was deemed the most sincere way to, in fact, worship. And that's exactly what Job is doing. What do you not see? You don't see a fist being raised to heaven. You don't hear cursing proceeding from his mouth. You see him rise, tear his robe, strip himself of his own glory, fall to the ground, prostrate, face in the dirt, worshiping Yahweh. Rather than curse God to his face, as the devil proposed, Job buries his face and worships. I think about a dear friend of mine. He stood right in this pulpit during our fire conference, Donnie Martin, the last night of our conference, when he and his wife Mary were missionaries in Mexico, in a rural village in Mexico with nothing. And she gave birth to their child, and their child died shortly after birth. Donnie carrying a little pine box with his newborn baby down the dirt road to a graveyard where they were getting ready to bury it. Quoting out loud to all spectators, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What do you think? Who do you think was the only one cursing at this moment? That's right, Satan. This had not turned out at all like he had anticipated. Quite the contrary. Knowing men as he does, he would have never wagered that this would be the response of Job to these horrendous losses. I imagine that his demonic horde simply stood in shock. Because they had done their work well, hadn't they? But Job is not through yet. Look at verse 21. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He puts things in proper perspective, doesn't he? His point is very simple. Every man, comes into the world the same way and leaves the very same way. We brought nothing with us at our birth, and we will take nothing with us to the grave. That's the right perspective, isn't it? Paul tells Timothy basically the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7, when he says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. Oh, you might be buried with your wealth, but where are you going to take it? I remember my first funeral that I performed in Georgia, my very, very, very first funeral by myself as a pastor. And my first little church was a retired minister who had been in a nursing facility for quite a few years with Alzheimer's, and he passed away, and his wife, who was a member of our church, asked me to do his funeral. And I did. And I remember the night when I went to greet the family for the viewing the first night, and I got there early, intentionally. And I walked into the funeral home, and there were different parlors where they would have the different bodies. And I walked by this one parlor, and there was a party going on. I mean, cigarette smoke coming out of the parlor. And this is the 80s in Georgia. Did I say anything else? Rural Georgia at that. And all the stuff going on, and people had alcoholic beverages. And I kind of glanced in the room, and I looked at the coffin, and all this stuff, there's the body, you can see the body laying in the coffin, and there's all this stuff in the coffin. There's unopened whiskey bottles and cartons of cigarettes and all kinds of paraphernalia. And I just had to inquire. And it happened to be the husband of the wife of the fortune teller in the city. And so this was their way of saying they were giving him stuff to carry into the afterlife so he wouldn't go there destitute. I got news for them, but I wasn't about to tell them. And then I walked into Brother Woodruff's room, a few doors down. And when I walked in that room, I was just overwhelmed by the quiet and the sweetness of the presence of God as I looked in that coffin of a man of God who'd preached the gospel for decades, laying there, and thought, oh, what a contrast and a peace this man now has to the torture that man's suffering. Puts things in proper perspective. Job knew everything he had came from God, even his children. Even his children. And rather than curse Yahweh, he blesses his name. Blessed be Yahweh. Job's confidence, I'm almost done. Job's confidence contrary to what Satan thought, was not in his possessions at all, not even in his posterity. He loses it all and worships God. At least in the first test, the devotion of Job to Yahweh is proven genuine. In closing, verse 22. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. What has Satan failed to do? He has failed to break Job and has failed to make Job curse God. However, sadly, the story is far from over, isn't it? Though angered over his failure to break Job, he is not about to quit. Though sinister indeed, he is quite persistent. And we can see that in his harassment even of Jesus, right? You would think that after the wilderness temptations, that he would have just gone on about his business and left this person alone. But every time Jesus showed up in the synagogue to teach, demons manifested. Every time he was doing street evangelism, demons were manifesting. People were bringing demon-possessed people to him. Even on the night of his death, of his arrest, prior to his death the next day. Where's Satan? In the garden, whispering in his ear, if you're really him, you can stop this. He's sinister, but he's not a quitter. Take heed, believer. And this is my closing tonight. We'll pick up maybe verse 22 a little bit when we come together next time. In chapter 2, the prologue continues and the stakes are raised. You would think, well, how in the world do you raise them higher than losing all your material blessings and losing your posterity as well? But the stakes are raised. And then what happens there kind of sets the stage for what goes on in the rest of this drama. Along with the lessons for us in this part of chapter 1 comes the events of chapter 2, where we are once again taken again to heaven for the second time, where the council is convening again. And there is that arch enemy showing up one more time. Next time we'll look at what we can glean from what we saw in chapter 1, and then we'll move into the events of chapter 2. Hopefully we can conclude that in one session next week. If I don't, I'll be here till God only knows how long, getting through these 42 chapters. Let's pray in closing. Father, this is truly is weighty material. There's so much in it that grabs our minds and our attention and even our hearts. And yet it is so rich and so full of instruction for us. We are, if I see anything, and I see a lot here, I see that we are to hold the things of this world very loosely. Very loosely. And yet we are to hold tenaciously to Christ. If we get that one lesson out of this tonight, it would have been worth the hour that we spent together. But there's so much more that I trust we have gleaned from the text. As we leave here tonight, might we meditate on, might we thoughtfully consider all that we have read and all that we have heard. Might our devotion and our loyalty to you, Father, be strengthened and be even greater secured. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord, we pray. Amen. The Lord bless you.